Hello again and welcome everybody to another episode of SpectrumCast, specifically dedicated to modern data protection. I'm Steve Kenniston, your host, as always, joined by Randy Arsenault, Sean Sperry, and Tricia Jang. Good to see you guys today. Hope you've been enjoying the last few podcasts. We've been doing them. We have had conversations about architecting data protection for scale. We've talked about architecting with tape. We've talked about data protection in the world of COVID. A lot of good topics, a lot of good things. Today, we want to talk a little bit about data protection in the world of cyber resiliency, cybersecurity, malware attacks, and that sort of thing. So we had a great experience last time having Sean be our host, be our leader. So Sean, why don't I pass it to you, and why don't you start us off here?
Okay, well, I guess I'll start off with the obvious question, which is the question I usually ask. Someone want to take a shot at what cyber resiliency and cybersecurity is? I've heard a lot about it over these last couple years, Steve, but I'd like to hear what you think it actually boils down to.
No, I'll say chair recognizes the storage alchemist, so go ahead.
Yeah, and I'm glad you started with that one, Sean. That's a good one, because a lot of times, especially in the systems organization, we get faced with clients when we visit them talking about cybersecurity, and we really talk to them about, from the systems aspect, cyber resiliency. I break it down very simply. Cybersecurity is the wall around your environment that keeps the bad actors out. Cyber resiliency is when we know they're going to come in, and they will. How quickly can you rebuild your infrastructure? That's my simple one take, but I'd like other people to maybe chime in.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's exactly I mean, there's a million different dimensions you can use or along which you can take the conversation to define cyber resiliency and cybersecurity, but I view it the same way. It's essentially, I view cybersecurity as more the threat detection and prevention side of it, and cyber resiliency is kind of the rapid recoverability. So as a storage portfolio brand, we tend to be more oriented towards the kind of resiliency side of the house. Although we do some things, which I'm sure you'll talk about, that are on the detection end as well. But I think we're primarily focused on the recovery side. What I think is interesting is the broader, cross-brand story. The IBM security story is really compelling. I mean, IBM is inarguably a global thought leader in cyber resiliency and cybersecurity. So I think it's a good place to be. And it's a good platform to use to share the narrative with our clients.
Well, I guess that's kind of a good kickoff to my next question. And why do you think this is so important today? I mean, I know I've been reading a lot more about these attacks. And I mean, I read the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and a lot of these other periodicals like everybody else. And it seems like not a day goes by that I don't read about some large business, not, a little bitty small company that maybe doesn't have the resources to invest in security going down, but really big businesses getting hacked and either losing information, having it stolen, or having a ransom put on them where they had to pay to get it back.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of when, not if, that somebody's going to get hit by this.
And I think that's changed over the years, to be honest with you. I mean, my perception is that when I started doing this 25 years ago, I mean, yes, you certainly had corporate firewalls and you had to be careful and you had security practices and best practices, but it wasn't like an incident a day occurred where somebody got hacked and got their whole system, their whole environment taken down.
Yeah, I think there's two things that have contributed to that. Number one, data over time has become more and more the most critical asset of every organization. So obviously financial, wherewithal and financial security are important, but data security, data is really the lifeblood of most organizations now. They're data driven, they're decision driven. That's number one. And number two, the bad actors and the influences are becoming increasingly sophisticated. I mean, a lot of these are now very, very well funded, in some cases state sponsored, entities that are, responsible for these broad scale and far reaching attacks. So I think those two things have converged to create this environment in which Cyber threats are never going to go away. They're only going to get more sophisticated, more pervasive, more tenuous, and more difficult to detect and prevent.
And they have no scruples. I mean, at the end of the day, we saw in this time of COVID, right, the number of attacks practically went up by the factor of 4. I think we were talking to some folks at Verizon who were just kind of watching, and it's not that they were 4 times more sophisticated. I just think they were trying to exploit vulnerabilities of the new normal, people working from home, because that's how they make their money.
And I think that attack is not the widespread piece. It's going to be, a lot of these attacks, extremely widespread, not just single incidences.
Yeah. Well, I mean, with regard to the sophistication, I mean, I can say I have personally been involved with some of our customers where the level of sophistication has just gotten to the point where it's amazing. I mean, in the past, when attacks came in, it was more like shutting down a network or a denial of service attack. And we kind of assumed that the attackers didn't really have the sophisticated knowledge of the back-end infrastructure like IBM produces to go out there and harm it, right? But now I am seeing and hearing stories of more attacks where not only do they get into an environment and try and steal things, but they will have the sophistication to understand the back-end data protection systems, to understand all of these technologies, new technologies, and go out there, attack them.
And it might be more time-based, where that attack is something's planted many months ahead of time, so that when it does go off and you start even going into the backup systems to pull things back, those also might potentially already be infected.
Yeah, I think that's the real scary part, is kind of the dormant attacks that will kind of sit in the infrastructure, kind of silently awaiting for the right opportunity. And to Sean's point, they will understand the generational, characteristics of your backup policies. So they'll know at what point to wake up and start, wreaking havoc in the production environment, knowing perhaps that you no longer have the ability to quickly recover back to a last known good state. So it's really a scary kind of combination or convergence of this.
In addition, the hackers are going after the backups right on their first shot, because they know that's, if I introduce a ransomware, I know the first thing I am going to do as a customer is I'm going to try to recover my data. Well, if the hackers have already infiltrated the backup, you're kind of at a loss. And to Trisha's point, right, this longevity of how you protect your information starts to become more and more crucial. It's not just the instant ability to instantly recover. It's what is my last good known state that I can get back to.
Well, and maybe that's a good jumping off point to, I mean, we've been doing backups and data protection forever now, right? And so maybe you can talk, Steve or Trisha or Randy, about how backups are different for cyber resiliency than they are for just regular old data protection that we've been doing for the last 50 years.
I think one of the first pieces goes back to tape and having that air gap, as well as that long-term retention, so that I know how long that data's been out there and how long it should have been safe, so that people couldn't have planted something long-term into that backup.
Yeah, I think when we had the podcast where we talked about tape, we talked about it making a resurgence based on the fact that it provides that only real true air gapping capability to be able to put data on to get it off of the network so that it doesn't actually get attacked. I've seen strategies now, so we've seen tape come back quite a bit, and I've seen strategies now where clients are using the whole belts and suspenders methodology. That being, I want to put in place a new or modern solution that actually maybe does things like snapshotting and that sort of thing, puts it on immutable storage. I can do instant recovery from stuff like that, as long as, again, the hackers haven't put some malware in there. So if I catch something really quick, I have an opportunity to do fast recovery. But if I can't get through that cycle of, the last known 4, 5, 6 good snaps, or maybe even weeks worth of snaps, I can really only rely on tape to be able to get my information back.
That touches on an interesting point, and we've been talking a lot lately about kind of portfolio messaging and what are the significant differentiators that we think we bring to the market from our portfolio perspective. And certainly one of them, I believe, is the ability to do that rolling rapid recovery. So starting with near real-time snaps and working your way back to that last known good state as quickly, efficiently, and in many cases automatically as possible. So that's a huge differentiator, I think. And again, you guys are much more familiar with the solutions than I am, but that strikes me as a really significant and really defensible differentiator.
And I think that snapshot gives you that immediate being able to roll something back. But if you do find you've got to go further back in history, not only did tape give you the air gap, but tape also gave you that inexpensive long-term storage.
Is immutable storage just as good as tape?
This is like a religious crusade.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's a religious question, I know.
Yeah, conceptually and philosophically, yeah. I mean, the idea of immutability is immutability. It's there aren't degrees of immutability, right? It's a binary thing. However, and this is where I always kind of divert a little bit on the discussion. Immutable vaults in cause, for instance, are a secured platform for long-term immutable storage of archived data, but they are connected and online and available, whereas a tape cartridge is physically removed with no innate or inherent or embedded ability to be read. And I'm not saying that correctly, but it is useless in and of itself. It can't be read. You can't pick it up and hold it up to a light and read it. So I think that, and we get into arguments about this all the time. I believe that tape is the only truly air-gapped data protection solution, unless you think about a laptop with no Wi-Fi that you kind of disconnect from the network and lock in a vault somewhere. So yes, immutability is immutability. However, I think you can make the case kind of intellectually and conceptually that tape is the only true immutable air gap solution.
To me, if you can change it via software, it's not immutable, right? And that's what that tape provides. It provides that physical interaction, that physical switch that requires actually somebody do something in person physically to make a change.
And I think, Sean, that's the main point, right? I Randy and I are kind of of the same ilk, right? Immutability is immutability, right? But the difference is exactly what you said. It's software, and anything you can develop in software, you can re-architect, you can reverse engineer, and you can get into it somehow. Have the hackers done it yet? No, right? But my question, and I think the question everyone should ask themselves that's architecting a solution for cybersecurity or to be able to recover from an attack is, do you want to be the first one that puts your data on immutable storage and they've reversed engineer how to be able to corrupt that kind of data? I don't know. Whereas with tape, to your point, if I pull it out, I really don't have that type of option to be able to corrupt that information.
Well, I think again, it speaks to kind of the breadth and depth of the portfolio that I think we uniquely bring to market. So we can offer clients everything along that spectrum and continuum, from localized, small footprint, high performance snaps that are very rapidly accessible, all the way up to and including physically air gap tape sitting off site somewhere.
I was going to say, I've seen some schemes that just rely on taking the networking offline, right? Where, I mean, it's not necessarily immutable storage, but like, we're going to store this and take the networking offline to where it's not accessible most of the time, but only the 30 minutes a day when we need to update it, right?
Yeah, and I mean, that's
is that
kind
acceptable
of the
risk?
Yeah, that's kind of the concept
Right.
behind safeguard copy too, right? You've got isolated network segments and network subnets that are inaccessible or can't communicate with one another. Although, again, I would argue if you have a disgruntled employee or somebody on site with physical access to that infrastructure, all bets are off in that environment anyway. So again, I keep coming back to tape as being really the most robust, reliable, safe, defensible.
The point I was going to make is it doesn't matter if you have all this great technology, if you leave open the gaps of the obvious, the disgruntled employee, the lousy passwords, those type of sloppy errors that could be easily hardened. if the structure is in an environment and the people are conscious of that.
And I think I said this a couple weeks ago, right? That really cybersecurity is all of our responsibility. And, you know, as a consultant, and I know all of us have been consultant and going into other shops, I can't tell you how many shops I've been in where they have multiple users using the same accounts. They had very poor passwords, you know, just the simplest things. And if you don't do that, right, then all of these other sophisticated methods and methodologies and analyses really aren't going to help, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and I think it increasingly requires engineering security into your workloads and your applications from the very beginning, as opposed to creating an application, throwing it over the fence, you know, into production and let the operations team figure out, you know, how to secure it and prevent, you know, unauthorized access to it. You know, it's more incumbent upon developers now and architects to design that level of security. The good news is, I think it has gotten easier in the sense that there's widely available libraries and key management systems that make engineering and designing in that security a little bit easier. But it's still important that it be designed in from the very beginning. And for instance, I know when we take clients through an MVP, you know, design thinking exercise in a garage environment or something, that security plays a key role in that. So they're going to make sure that that security instrumentation is developed and engineered in from the very beginning of the architecture.
One of the original comments about IBM really being a leader in that, and I know with Spectrum Protect, we've started utilizing the GS kit, which is an IBM security tool, in our certification when our Spectrum Protect server talks to clients. So that goes back to, not only does the corporation have to be really careful about how they manage security, but the products they're buying and purchasing have to be supporting that as well.
I also think that that IT, as they approach and look at, you know, we've talked about all of this recoverability based on cyber attacks, and this whole podcast is about cyber resiliency. But I don't think that IT should look at this as something holistically brand new, right? I think the foundational components of your disaster recovery strategy, as Sean pointed out, things you want to be thinking about what is an acceptable amount of risk? What are your SLAs? Is your data classified? Can you quickly recover one segment of most important data vis-a-vis some less important data? And then you start looking at how do you close those risk gaps when it comes to cyber attacks? So things like creating that true air gap to tape, or whatever it is to be able to get to that true protection, right? Think of these as stepping stones and components to actually building up not only disaster recovery. I always say if you have a cyber attack, you have a disaster. So building up your disaster recovery and then adding on the cyber resiliency components to that is really important.
And I think that disaster recovery, unlike if you just had a hardware failure and did a DR of a server, or if you had a hurricane and had to replace something, that's very different if you're in a cyber attack recovery, because now you've got to be conscious of, I've got to bring this back into an environment that's not going to reinfect what I've already brought up. So having that closed network and capabilities, as well as abilities to go back multiple versions or whatever you need to do. So the DR plan has to extend to the disaster being a cyber attack.
We've just made the poor disaster, as if the disaster recovery manager's job wasn't tough enough, right? Now we've given him something else to think about, right? Made it worse. And you can't only go back to your last good copy. It's like, it needs to be a really good, clean copy, and you have to figure out what that is.
And to test to make sure it's okay, you got to put it in a clean environment. Do you have one? It's a good place where a lot of opportunities for cloud. I want to recover to the cloud. It's clean, it's empty, it's isolated. I want to test it. Then I can think about, you know, bringing it back. I mean, there are a lot of options today, but still, you're adding on to the confusion or to the opportunities for mistakes and that sort of thing for the team.
Well, yeah, and I think it also, you know, to your point, disaster recovery, you know, traditional backup and recovery is really the progenitor of what we think about today as resiliency, right? So the ability, you know, simply put, resiliency is the ability to get back to a last known good, you know, clean state without corruption, without risk, without, you know, whatever threat has been posed. So that's part and parcel to how you design your disaster recovery and how you do your backups and how you do your recovery plans and how you do your, periodic testing of disaster events. So you can't have one without the other. So I think that also gives us somewhat of an advantage, given that we've got this long, history and provenance of data protection and backup and recovery, many, many years and decades even. So now as we roll forward into this uncertain future of all the cyber attacks and increased risk of more sophisticated attacks, I think we've got the institutional experience, we've got the IP, we've got the products that we can use to attack that space. And, I'll say it again, working in conjunction with our partners in the security team, which are world-renowned and, world-leading experts and thought leaders in security best practices, that gives us a pretty compelling story to tell. And I think it really rounds out our whole cyber resiliency and cybersecurity narrative.
Okay. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Does anybody want to make any last comments or any additional comments? I know we can really sit around and talk about this for hours, to be honest with you, because there's a lot of facets to it. But
so Dan Thompson in our group has put together a good video that I put out on my YouTube channel that really talks about hardening your environment and really thinking through this disaster recovery. So if you've got a little bit longer, go and check out that video.
yeah, I highly commend that video. I think it's entitled Top 10 Ways, or at least there's one that's entitled Top 10 Ways to Protect, to Harden Your Spectrum Protect Server. And if you have a chance to watch it, a lot of them are really simple things, right? I mean, it's not this complex, framework of 1,000 pages. It's just simple things that you should be doing on a daily basis to make sure that your Spectrum Protect server is well protected in the event of one of these.
I'll put in a plug for
attacks.
Trish's YouTube channel in general, which is awesome. So go check.
Okay.
And I wanted to thank everybody for joining. And I wanted to say, if you want to learn more about cyber resiliency, at our Tech U that Sean plugged last episode, the last week of October, we have a lot of sessions around cyber resiliency and how to recover from cyber attacks and that sort of thing. So I think it'll be very educational. I think you should check it out. So thanks again, everyone. You know how to get in contact with us, and we hope to hear from you. Thank you.